Ever wonder what life was really like if you were a young woman in the year 960? Imagine being told your entire future depended on one thing, marriage. But what if you said no? What if you refused or simply couldn't find a match? What would happen to you in a world where a woman without a husband was often seen as having no place at all? Number 7. The scholarly path. A glimmer of forbidden knowledge. Picture this. It's the year 960. The world you inhabit is dominated by vast, sweeping fields, dense forests, and the imposing stone structures of castles and churches. Life is hard, often short, and almost entirely dictated by the seasons, the land, and the rigid social order. For a young woman, your destiny, for the most part, is carved out for you long before you even understand the concept of choice. Your value is typically tied to your ability to secure a suitable marriage, produce heirs, and manage a household. That's the grand plan, the accepted narrative, the entire expectation from the moment you are born. But what if your spirit yearned for something more, something entirely different? What if the idea of domestic duties, of endless childbearing, of being solely defined by your husband's lineage simply didn't resonate with the quiet fire burning within you? This path, the scholarly path, was less an option and more a miracle. A tiny pinprick of light in an overwhelmingly dark sky. It wasn't a common route, not by a long shot, and it certainly wasn't about independent research or publishing groundbreaking theories in a public square. That idea was as alien to 960 as the concept of flying to the moon. Instead, for the incredibly few women who might have pursued knowledge for its own sake, it was almost exclusively found behind the sturdy, protective walls of a convent. Imagine growing up in a world where literacy, the ability to read and write, was a rare and precious commodity. Most people, even many lords and ladies, couldn't read beyond their own name. If that knowledge was held, guarded, and disseminated primarily by the church. Monasteries and convents were the true centers of learning, their scriptoria, the engines of preservation and creation. So, if you were a woman with an insatiable curiosity, a mind that craved understanding beyond the daily rhythms of life on the manor, the convent might have seemed like the only place where such a desire wasn't just tolerated. Entering a convent was a major decision, one that usually required a dowry, a payment from your family to the institution, much like a marriage dowry. It wasn't a casual choice, nor was it always made purely out of spiritual devotion. For some, it was a practical solution when a suitable marriage couldn't be arranged. But for that rare individual who held a secret passion for illuminated manuscripts, for the intricate patterns of Latin grammar, or the profound theological discussions of the early church fathers, the convent offered an unparalleled, almost hidden opportunity. Life inside a convent, even for a woman devoted to study, was far from leisurely. The days were structured by the strictures of monastic life. Prayer at prescribed hours throughout the day and night, communal meals, periods of silence, and various duties. You might spend hours tending to the convent's gardens, preparing food, cleaning, or assisting with the care of the sick. But nestled within this rigorous schedule, there would be dedicated time for reading, for copying texts, for composing hymns or spiritual works. For some, this was where their true purpose lay. Consider the challenges these women faced. There were no easily accessible libraries. Every book, every parchment was a unique hand-copy treasure. Access to these precious texts would be limited, determined by the prioress and the convent's resources. Learning Latin, the language of scholarship, scripture, and official church documents, would be a monumental undertaking, often without formal teachers beyond the senior nuns. Imagine deciphering complex texts by the flickering light of a candle. your fingers tracing the elegant yet often difficult script, the weight of centuries of thought resting in your hands. The subjects available for study were also highly circumscribed. Your focus would almost certainly be on religious texts, the Bible, commentaries on Scripture, lives of saints, patristic writings, and liturgical works. You might delve into the history of the Church, or perhaps the elements of arithmetic and music theory necessary for understanding church liturgy. Philosophy, if studied, would be firmly rooted in theological principles, not the free-ranging inquiry of later centuries. The world outside the convent walls, with its political intrigues and nascent scientific discoveries, would mostly remain a distant echo. Yet, within these confines, remarkable intellectual feats could occur. Some convents were renowned for their vibrant intellectual life, where nuns not only copied texts but also composed their own. Picture a woman perhaps known only by her religious name, hunched over a parchment, her quill scratching out lines of poetry, a dramatic play based on biblical stories, or a meticulously detailed chronicle of her time. These works, often intended only for the eyes of her sisters within the convent, represented an astonishing act of defiance against the prevailing illiteracy and intellectual suppression of women. They were a testament to the power of a mind determined to learn and create. The social perception of such a woman was complex. Outside the convent, she would be seen as a woman of God, revered for her piety and devotion. Her refusal of marriage would be framed not as a rejection of societal norms, but as a higher calling, a spiritual union with Christ. Within the convent, her intellectual prowess might earn her respect and influence, perhaps leading to positions of authority like prioress or mistress of the novices, where she could guide and educate younger nuns. However, her learnedness would always be understood through the lens of her religious identity. She was not a scholar in the modern sense, pursuing knowledge for its own sake in a secular sphere. Her scholarship was a form of prayer, a deeper understanding of the divine. This path offered a unique kind of freedom. While physically confined, her mind could roam. She might find a profound sense of purpose and intellectual fulfillment that was utterly unavailable to most women of her time. Quiet hum of the scriptorium, the rustle of parchment, the scent of ink, the endless pursuit of understanding, these would be her daily companions, her world. It was a life of discipline, of solitude, but also for the chosen few, a life of profound intellectual engagement, a rare and precious rebellion against the intellectual darkness of the age. It was a refusal of marriage that led not to destitution, but to a different, equally demanding, but potentially deeply rewarding form of service and self-discovery. This was a path chosen by the very few, a silent revolution of the mind. Number 6. The desperate survival path. A life on the fringes. Imagine you've refused marriage, or perhaps the circumstances of your life have made it impossible to secure a match. You don't have a family with the resources to send you to a convent, or perhaps your spiritual leanings don't draw you to monastic life. What then? For many, the refusal of marriage, whether by choice or by sheer bad luck, meant being cast out or at least pushed to the very edges of society. This wasn't an option in the sense of a desirable choice, but rather a brutal reality, a fight for sheer survival in a world that had little pity for those without protection or status. This path was the road of desperation, of hunger, of constant vulnerability. The world of 960 Aud was incredibly dangerous, especially for an unaccompanied woman. There was no social safety net, no government welfare programs, no formal protections for the individual who fell through the cracks. Your survival depended almost entirely on your family, your community, or your lord. If you were a woman without a husband, without a father or brother to claim you, you were quite literally fair game. The concept of individual rights was centuries away. Your physical safety, your very life, could be threatened daily. So, what did life on the fringes look like? It often meant a nomadic existence, wandering from village to village, hoping for scraps, for a moment of kindness, for a temporary roof over your head. You would carry what little you owned, perhaps a worn blanket, a crude eating utensil, a small pouch of dried herbs or roots you'd gathered. Your days would be consumed by the relentless search for food. This might involve begging at the gates of a manor house, offering to do menial tasks for a bowl of gruel, or searching the forests for wild edibles, nuts, berries, fungi, though this carried the constant risk of poisoning or encountering wild animals. Begging was a common yet utterly humiliating. He would stand at the edges of market squares, outside churches, or by busy roads, holding out a hand, your voice hoarse from exposure and hunger. People might ignore you, curse you, or occasionally toss a stale piece of bread or a copper coin. The perception of beggars was often mixed. While Christian charity might encourage almsgiving, there was also a pervasive belief that poverty was a sign of divine displeasure or moral failing. You were not just poor, you were often seen as a burden, an outsider, perhaps even a potential thief. For a woman, there was an added layer of vulnerability. The constant threat of violence, of assault, was ever present. With no male protector, you were an easy target. Imagine the fear, the constant vigilance, the instinct to avoid crowds, yet simultaneously needing their presence for opportunities to beg or work. Shelter would be rudimentary at best. A lean-to against a tree, a cave, a derelict shed, or perhaps, on a rare lucky night, the warmth of a common fire in a village if you were allowed to stay. Sleep would be fitful, haunted by the cold, the hunger, and the fear of the unknown. Beyond begging, how could such a woman survive? Some might attempt to offer their labor for temporary work. This could mean helping with the harvest during peak season, carrying water, chopping wood, cleaning animal pens, or performing any task that required brute strength and little skill. The pay would be minimal, often just food for the day, and the work would be backbreaking. Competition for such labor was fierce, and a lone woman would often be overlooked in favor of a man or a family unit. There were also desperate paths that ventured into the illicit. Without means, without support, and facing starvation, some women were forced into activities that society condemned. This could involve petty theft, stealing a chicken from a farm, a loaf of bread from a market stall, anything to quiet the gnawing hunger. Punishments for such crimes were severe, often involving mutilation or even death, particularly for repeat offenders. The risk was constant, the reward fleeting. Another incredibly grim reality, though often unspoken and certainly not an option in any voluntary sense, was resorting to what were then called illicit means of survival. For a woman without protection or resources, this often meant trading her body for food, for shelter, or for a temporary reprieve from starvation. This was not a profession chosen but a desperate act of survival. A final, terrible descent into a life of profound vulnerability and degradation. The social stigma attached to such a life was immense, leading to further ostracization and making any return to a more conventional existence nearly impossible. You would be scorned, judged, and often treated with contempt by the very society that had pushed you to such extremes. Life on the fringes meant constant exposure to disease, to the elements, to starvation, and to violence. Medical care was non-existent for the poor, and even common ailments could quickly turn fatal. Cold, a broken bone, an infected cut, any of these could mean the end. Your lifespan would likely be tragically short, your days filled with an unending struggle simply to exist. There was little hope for advancement, for stability, or for finding any semblance of peace. This was the raw, brutal truth for many women who, for whatever reason, found themselves outside the protective boundaries of marriage and family in 960 AD. It was a life stripped bare of dignity, security, and often even basic humanity. It served as a stark warning, a chilling reminder of the utter vulnerability of a woman without a place in the rigidly structured society of the early Middle Ages. It was not a choice, but a default, a tragic consequence of having no other options. Number 5. The independent trade path. A risky gamble for autonomy. Imagine a flicker of ambition, a stubborn refusal to be defined by a husband, and a knack for a certain skill. Could a woman in 960 AD truly carve out an independent life for herself, supporting herself through a trade or craft, particularly if she refused marriage? This path was a formidable challenge, a high-stakes gamble against overwhelming odds. But for a determined and resourceful few, it was a desperate attempt at autonomy. This wasn't about setting up a grand shop on a bustling street, but about eking out a living with a specific skill, often from the quiet confines of one's home or a small, often makeshift space. The concept of a single woman running a business was incredibly rare. Society was structured around family units and male authority. Guilds, which would later organize many trades, were only just beginning to form in some areas, and they were almost exclusively male-dominated. A woman, by herself, lacked the legal standing, the financial capital, and the social connections to easily establish herself in a competitive market. Furthermore, many trades were considered male domains, requiring apprenticeships and physical strength that were typically inaccessible or deemed inappropriate for women. However, certain traditional skills were often associated with women, particularly those related to the household or the care of the community. These were the areas where a woman might, with immense effort and a bit of luck, find a niche. Think of skills like brewing ale or mead, baking bread, spinning wool, weaving simple cloths, or even midwifery and traditional healing. These were not considered high-status professions, but they provided essential services that the community needed. Consider the woman who might become a brewer. Ale was a staple drink, safer than water in many places, and consumed by almost everyone. Brewing was often a domestic task, done by women within their households. But if you were a woman who didn't marry, you might try to scale this up, brewing more than your own household needed and selling the surplus. You would likely set up a simple stall at a local market if one existed, or simply sell from your doorway. Your reputation for good ale would be crucial. The challenges? Sourcing ingredients, maintaining quality without modern equipment, dealing with male vendors who might see you as competition, and the constant need to protect your earnings in a cash-poor society prone to theft. You would likely be a brewster, a term that carried its own social connotations, sometimes less than flattering. Or imagine a woman who became a baker. Bread was the staff of life. If you had access to an oven, perhaps a communal one, or a very basic one in your dwelling, and could consistently produce edible loaves, you might find a steady, albeit meager, income. Again, you would sell directly to neighbors or at a small market. Your days would be filled with the physical labor of kneading dough, tending fires, and the precise timing required for baking. This was back-breaking work, often done from dawn until dusk. Another common skill was textile production. If you had inherited a loom, or could afford to acquire one, you might spin wool and weave simple woolen cloths. This was often done as piecework for a local lord or merchant, who would provide the raw materials and pay a pittance for the finished goods. It was a solitary, tedious occupation, but it could keep a roof over your head and food in your belly. Quality of your work, your speed, and your ability to meet deadlines were your only currency. Midwifery and traditional healing were also paths some women pursued. These were ancient practices passed down through generations, often requiring no formal training, just experience and a reputation for efficacy. A woman who was skilled in delivering babies or preparing herbal remedies might travel from village to village or serve a specific community, being paid in kind food, shelter, or small sums of money. This profession, however, came with immense responsibility and risk. If a birth went wrong or a remedy failed, you could face blame, ostracization, or even accusations of witchcraft. It was a life of service, but one fraught with danger and deep social suspicion. The woman who chose, or was forced onto this path was a true anomaly. She was a survivor, independent, out of necessity, working relentlessly against a backdrop of limited resources, social censure, and constant economic insecurity. She would have to be incredibly resilient, resourceful, and possess an unwavering self-reliance. Her social standing would be ambiguous. She was not married, which was a strike against her, but she was contributing to the local economy, which might earn her a grudging respect. She would likely live a solitary life, her days defined by the rhythm of her trade, her evenings spent safeguarding her meager earnings and preparing for the next day's labor. This path, while offering a semblance of autonomy, was a constant struggle. There were no safety nets, no pensions, no sick leave. A bad harvest, a sudden illness, a theft, or a change in local demand could easily send her spiraling into destitution. It was a precarious existence, a testament to the sheer determination of women who simply refused to vanish or be defined by their marital status. It was a defiant whisper of self-sufficiency in a world that sought to silence it. Number 4. The service path, an unseen existence of toil. Let's be honest, not every woman who refused marriage, or for whom marriage simply wasn't an option, came from a family of means or possessed a specialized skill. For the vast majority of women without family protection or a suitable husband, the most common and often the only recourse was to enter into service in another household. This was a life of unremitting toil, an existence largely unseen and unappreciated, where your days were filled with the demands of others, and your identity was tied to the household you served. It was a path of quiet subjugation, offering minimal security in exchange for relentless labor. Imagine leaving your own humble home, perhaps after the death of your parents, or because your family simply couldn't afford to feed another mouth. You would seek employment usually in a wealthier household, whether that of a minor lord, a prosperous peasant, or a town merchant. Your position would be at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, a serving woman, maidservant, or handmaiden, terms that encompassed a vast range of duties and very little personal dignity. Your days would begin before dawn, often with the first light, and stretch long past dusk. The work was physical, repetitive, and endless. You would be responsible for tasks that would make a modern person blanch. Picture hauling heavy buckets of water from the well, sometimes many times a day, to fill jugs for drinking, cooking, and washing. Imagine stooping over a rudimentary fire, tending to pots of simmering stew, or turning a spit for hours on end, the smoke stinging your eyes. You would clean, sweep dirt floors with a rough broom, scrub wooden tables and empty chamber pots. Laundry, a monumental task in itself, involved hours of scrubbing clothes in cold water, using harsh lye soap, and then hanging them to dry wherever possible. For those in a lord's household, you might also be responsible for dressing your mistress, brushing her hair, fetching her slippers, or running endless errands. You would care for children, sometimes acting as wet nurse if needed, changing their soiled clothing, comforting them, and ensuring their safety. Even if you were not the primary cook, you would be involved in the preparation of meals, plucking chickens, skinning rabbits, pounding grains, peeling roots, and cleaning fish. There was no escaping the chores, no respite from the constant demands of the household. Your living conditions would be rudimentary. You would likely sleep on a straw mattress in a shared space, perhaps in the kitchen, a pantry, or a small unheated annex. Privacy was a luxury you simply did not have. Your meals would be the leftovers from the family table, or simpler, coarser fare prepared specifically for the servants. Your clothing would be plain, functional, and mended until it could be mended no more. Comfort was a distant concept, and warmth a fleeting pleasure. Payment for your labor would be meager, often just your food and lodging. Actual wages, in coin, might be a rare occurrence, perhaps a small sum at the end of the year, if you were lucky. This left you with little to save, little to call your own, and no means to escape your situation. Your entire existence depended on the goodwill, or at least the toleration, of your employer. The social standing of a serving woman was virtually non-existent. You were not a member of the family, yet you lived under their roof, and were entirely subservient to their will. You were subject to their whims, their tempers, and their strict rules. Disobedience could lead to dismissal, which for a woman without other options was a sentence to destitution. There was little opportunity for advancement unless you were exceptionally skilled and managed to secure a position as a senior maid, overseeing other servants. But even then, your life was still one of perpetual service. For a woman who refused marriage or was simply unmarried, this path was often chosen out of sheer necessity. It offered a degree of physical safety and the basic provision of food and shelter, which were precious commodities in 960 AD. However, it came at the cost of personal freedom, autonomy, and any semblance of an independent identity. Your life was not your own. It was dedicated to the service of others. The emotional toll of such a life would be immense. Days of endless labor years blurring into a monotonous routine. Little hope for change and a constant awareness of your low status. Friendships among fellow servants might offer some comfort, but there was little room for personal aspirations or dreams. This was an existence of quiet endurance, a life lived in the shadows, a testament to the harsh realities faced by women who stood outside the conventional framework of marriage and family in the early medieval period. It was a life of hard work, low reward, and an almost invisible presence in the grand tapestry of the age. Number 3. The dependent path, trapped in the family home. Imagine being a young woman in 960 AD and the prospect of marriage is simply not happening for you. Perhaps your family lacks the necessary dowry to make you an attractive prospect. Perhaps you are considered too plain, too sickly, or perhaps you genuinely refuse the idea of an arranged union. If your family possessed even a modest amount of land or a stable position, and if they were willing to keep you, then your option might be to remain within the family home. This wasn't a path of independence or empowerment, but rather a life of perpetual dependence, often as an unpaid domestic worker confined to the familiar yet restrictive walls of your kin. This scenario largely depended on the willingness and ability of your family to support you. In a society where every mouth needed to be fed and every hand was valued for labor, a grown woman who didn't marry could be seen as an economic burden. If your parents were still alive, they might keep you out of affection or duty. If they passed away, you might fall under the care of a brother or sister, perhaps their spouse, and this relationship could be fraught with tension and resentment. You were effectively a permanent houseguest who needed to earn her keep. Your daily life would involve a constant round of household chores, much like a servant, but without the pretense of wages. You would be expected to contribute fully to the running of the household. Imagine waking early to help prepare the morning meal, grinding grain, fetching water, stoking the fire. Your hands would be busy all day, spinning wool, mending clothes, caring for younger children, tending to a small garden, or even assisting with agricultural tasks on the family plot during harvest time. You would be performing the same duties a wife and mother would, but without the status, the security, or the authority that came with being the mistress of the house. The lack of personal agency would be profound. Your life would be dictated by the needs and desires of your family members, particularly the male head of the household, your father, brother, or brother-in-law. You would have no say in major decisions, no property rights, and certainly no voice in matters that concerned your own future. Your identity would be that of the unmarried daughter or sister, perpetually beholden to those who provided your shelter and sustenance. While this path offered a degree of physical safety and the certainty of food, it came at a significant emotional cost. You might constantly feel like a burden, a drain on family resources. There could be subtle, or not so subtle, resentment from your siblings, especially if their own families were growing and resources were stretched thin. Your presence might be tolerated but rarely celebrated. You would witness the lives of your married sisters and brothers unfold around you, their children, their growing autonomy, while your own life remained largely stagnant, confined to the same walls, the same routines, the same dependent status. Socially, your position would be ambiguous. You wouldn't be an outcast like a vagrant, but you also wouldn't have the respected status of a wife and mother. You might be viewed with pity, or perhaps with a touch of suspicion, as a woman who failed to fulfill her societal role. Your life would likely be defined by the absence of a husband and children, rather than by any independent accomplishments. Marital status was a primary determinant of a woman's place and respectability. In 960, ad teni. Without it, you were in many ways incomplete in the eyes of society. There would be little opportunity for social interaction outside the family unit, unless it involved tasks directly related to the household, like going to the market or attending church services. Your world would shrink, bounded by the walls of your home and the familiar faces of your relatives. Dreams of travel, of learning, of creating a life entirely your own would likely wither and die in the face of such a circumscribed existence. For a woman who chose to refuse marriage, this path was a compromise, a trade-off. It offered a degree of security, but at the expense of personal freedom and dignity. For those who simply couldn't secure a marriage, it was a default, the only available alternative to a much harsher existence. It was a life lived in the shadow of others, performing essential duties without recognition and forever dependent on the benevolence of family. It was a quiet imprisonment, a subtle form of societal control that ensured women without husbands still served a purpose, even if that purpose was simply to perpetually serve their kin. Number 2. The reclusive spiritual path. Walls of piety, walls of isolation. Imagine a spiritual yearning so intense, a desire for devotion so profound, that it led you to choose a life of extreme isolation. If you refused marriage in 960, and if you were truly consumed by a religious fervor beyond even the structured communal life of a convent, you might have sought the path of an anchoress or a hermit. This was not a common option, even among the most pious, but it represented the most radical form of spiritual dedication, a complete withdrawal from the world. It was a self-imposed spiritual imprisonment, a life lived quite literally within walls for the sake of God. The concept of an anchoress was particularly fascinating and terrifying. An anchoress was a woman who, after a solemn religious ceremony, would be literally enclosed within a small cell, often attached to a church or a monastery. This cell would have tiny windows, one looking into the church so she could participate in Mass and receive communion, and another covered by a curtain through which she could receive food and communicate with visitors, usually for spiritual guidance. A third window might exist to allow a view of the outside world, but this was less common and often discouraged. Once enclosed, the door to her cell was ceremoniously sealed, often with masonry, signifying her permanent separation from the world. She would never leave this cell until her death. This was not a life of luxury or ease. The cell would be tiny, cold in winter, stifling in summer. Her possessions would be few: a simple bed of straw, a crucifix, a Bible, perhaps a few devotional books. Her diet would be meager, primarily bread and water, with occasional simple vegetables or pulses. The days would be filled with prayer, meditation, and spiritual contemplation. Imagine the profound silence broken only by the bells of the church, the distant sounds of the village, or the quiet whispers of the wind. This was a life of extreme asceticism, a constant struggle against temptation and the limitations of the human body. The motivations for choosing such a path were deeply spiritual. An anchoress saw herself as a living sacrifice, a spiritual warrior praying for the sins of the world. Her isolation was a way to purify her soul, to draw closer to God without the distractions and temptations of earthly life. Her renunciation of marriage, of family, of all worldly ties, was complete. She was married to Christ, her life a testament to utter devotion. Beyond an anchoress, there were also female hermits, though these were even rarer and often less formally recognized by the Church. A hermit might live in a remote cave, a simple hut in the wilderness, or a secluded forest dwelling. Their lives would be even more solitary and dangerous than an anchoress, exposed to the elements, wild animals, and the risks of human predation. Their survival would depend entirely on their own resourcefulness, on the occasional charity of travelers, or on the spiritual support of a nearby monastic community. Like anchoresses, their days would be dedicated to prayer, fasting, and a life of extreme simplicity and self-denial. The social perception of these women was complex. On one hand, they were revered as living saints, figures of immense piety and spiritual power. People might come to their cell windows or their remote dwellings to seek their prayers, their spiritual advice, or simply to feel the presence of such holiness. They were seen as intermediaries between the earthly and the divine. On the other hand, their extreme isolation and unconventional lifestyle also made them subjects of awe mixed with a degree of fear or misunderstanding. Their choice was so radical, so profoundly different from the expected path for a woman, that it bordered on the incomprehensible for most. For a woman who refused marriage and sought a spiritual path beyond the convent, this option offered an absolute and undeniable freedom from the expectations of the world. No husband, no children, no domestic duties, no social obligation. Instead, there was a profound, almost terrifying freedom of the spirit. It was a path chosen by very few, and only by those with an iron will, an unshakable faith, and a complete detachment from worldly desires. This path was not about comfort or companionship. It was about profound spiritual struggle and an unwavering commitment to a higher calling. It was a life lived in constant contemplation of the divine, a silent, powerful testament to a woman's ability to forge her own destiny, even if that destiny was defined by absolute isolation and the constant pursuit of spiritual purity. It was the ultimate refusal of societal norms, a radical embrace of the sacred, hidden away from the world's prying eyes. Number 1. The spiritual path, the convent, a sacred haven, or hidden cage. If a woman in 960 had refused marriage, or if her family could not secure a suitable match, the most common and often the most respected alternative was to enter a convent and become a nun. This was not a light decision, nor was it always a matter of pure spiritual calling. For many, it represented the only viable option for a woman to live a life outside of marriage and yet retain her dignity, safety, and a degree of purpose in a deeply patriarchal society. It was a path that offered both a sanctuary from the world and, for some, a kind of gilded cage. Imagine you are a young woman from a noble or landholding family. Your family, for whatever reason, cannot arrange a marriage for you that meets their expectations. Perhaps they cannot afford a dowry, or political alliances have shifted, or perhaps you genuinely express a desire for a life of religious devotion. For such a family, placing a daughter in a convent was a respectable solution. It ensured her continued chastity, secured her a place in society, and often brought spiritual merit to the family. They would provide a nun's dowry, a donation of land, money, or goods to the convent, which helped support the institution and secure their daughter's place within it. This dowry was often significantly less than a marriage dowry, making it an attractive option for families with limited resources. Life within a convent was highly structured, governed by a set of rules, often those of Saint Benedict. Your days would be meticulously organized around the divine office, a series of prayers and services performed at specific hours throughout the day and night. You would rise before dawn for matins, follow with lauds, prime terce, sext, none, vespers, and finally compline before bed. This constant rhythm of prayer provided a profound spiritual anchor for daily life. Beyond prayer, your days would be filled with various duties essential to the running of the convent. This was not a life of idleness. You might be involved in agricultural work, tending the convent's fields or gardens to provide food. You could be assigned to the kitchen, preparing meals for the community. Other tasks included cleaning the common areas, washing clothes, mending vestments, or caring for the elderly and sick sisters. Many convents also ran hospices for travelers or infirmaries for the local poor, meaning nuns could also be involved in caregiving. Some convents were renowned centers of learning, as explored previously. If you had the inclination and ability, you might spend hours in the scriptorium, copying manuscripts, illuminating texts, or even composing your own works. This offered a unique intellectual outlet for women in an age where education was largely denied to them outside religious institutions. Could learn Latin, study the scriptures, delve into theological discussions, and contribute to the preservation of knowledge. The convent offered a powerful sense of community. You would live alongside other women who had made similar choices, forming a close-knit sisterhood. There was shared purpose, mutual support, and a sense of belonging that was often lacking for unmarried women in the outside world. You would find intellectual companionship, spiritual guidance, and enduring friendships. For many women, this communal life was a profound source of strength and solace. However, life in a convent was not without its challenges. It demanded strict obedience to the prioress and the convent's rules. Personal desires and individual will were largely suppressed in favor of communal harmony and spiritual discipline. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were lifelong commitments, requiring immense self-denial and unwavering faith. Leaving the convent was incredibly difficult, often impossible, and would lead to severe social ostracism and spiritual condemnation. While offering a safe haven, the convent also functioned as a kind of cage. Your world was limited to the convent walls, your interactions largely confined to your sisters and occasional visitors. You were cut off from the wider world, its political machinations, its social changes, and its personal relationships outside the sisterhood. For some, the enforced isolation and rigid routine could be stifling, leading to spiritual dryness or quiet despair. Yet, for many, it was precisely this ordered, contemplative life that brought them profound peace and purpose. For a woman who refused marriage, or was simply unmarried, the convent offered the ultimate in social acceptance and respectability. It was a path sanctioned by God and society, elevating her status from a potential burden to a bride of Christ. It allowed her to escape the often brutal realities of medieval marriage, the risks of childbirth, the subjugation to a husband, the endless domestic drudgery, and instead dedicate her life to spiritual pursuits and communal service. This was the most common and socially approved alternative for women who did not marry in 960 AD. It was a pragmatic choice for many families, a spiritual calling for some women, and a last resort for others. It offered security, a community, and a purpose, providing a unique space for women to exist outside the conventional expectations of the age, carving out a life defined by piety, discipline, and a quiet, profound devotion.